She didn't die alone in the tower. She died while her husband was already auditioning the woman who would wear her crown. In the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn was trapped inside the Tower of London, surrounded by stone walls and polite smiles that meant nothing. She could hear the river, the city England, continuing without her, and she knew the court had already started rewriting her. The horror is not only that Henry VIII, I wanted her gone. It's that, while Anne counted hours, Henry counted options. Jane Seymour was no longer a distant possibility. She was the plan, quietly forming, behind closed doors. This is the Tudor court, at its most brutal love, as cover law, as weapon, and a queen's downfall, treated like a scheduling problem. Anne's fate would be decided before any evidence was gathered, before any trial began, before anyone dared speak her name with sympathy. And the most devastating part is distance, not continent, not days, just 1 mile. 1 mile of river between a prisoner queen waiting for death and the woman being prepared to replace her. Stay with me, because once you see the timeline clearly, the story stops looking like scandal and starts looking like calculated execution. Henry's interest in Jane didn't begin with romance. It began with contrast. In September 1535, the royal progress arrived at Wolf Hall, in Wiltshire, home of the Seymour family. Henry came with Queen Anne, brilliant and sharp, still fighting to keep her footing. Among the women greeting the procession stood Jane Seymour, quiet, pale, and easy to overlook. She had served in Anne's household for years, familiar enough to seem harmless. But Henry noticed what Jane represented. Anne spoke like an equal. She argued, teased, demanded, challenged. Jane did none of that. Jane lowered her eyes. Jane waited. Jane looked like the soft answer to a king who had grown tired of being managed by the wife he once chased. Henry had loved Anne's fire when it made her a prize. Now that same fire felt like defiance, and defiance was never safe in a Tudor marriage. Jane and her brothers understood the risk instantly. A king's attention could raise a woman into jewels or drag her into ruin. The Seymours treated Henry's gaze like a crack in a wall and began to widen it carefully, quietly, with discipline. Back at court, Anne likely assumed Jane was furniture. But the men who survived by reading power saw the shift immediately. The first real move came through a gift. One day, one was summoned and handed a bundle from the king. Everyone at court understood what that meant. It wasn't charity. It was an invitation to become a royal favorite. This is where Jane's virtue becomes strategy. She didn't open the letter. She kissed it in outward respect and returned it unopened. She sent the gold back too, as if it were dangerous. Her message was perfectly shaped. She prized her honor above treasure, and if the king wished to favor her, it must be as a wife, not as a mistress. She challenged Henry without shaming him, making herself look pure while raising her value. For a man used to obedience, the refusal didn't cool desire, it sharpened it. Word spread fast through the inner circles. The Seymours understood how powerful this moment was. So did those who wanted Anne gone. Jane was being positioned as the opposite of Anne, modest, where Anne was bold, obedient, where Anne was sharp, silent, where Anne debated. Henry began to imagine Jane not as a fling, but as an escape route. A new wife meant a new chance at the one obsession that ruled everything a legitimate son. Jane held the line queen or nothing, and that line became the knife aimed at Anne's throat. By early 1536, the courtship stopped being private and turned into public maneuvering. Ambassadors took notes. Courtiers whispered. Bets were placed. The Seymours tightened control around Jane, guarding her reputation like it was currency, because it was. Thomas Cromwell saw the future before it arrived. He had helped Henry break from Rome to marry Anne. But now Anne was a liability. No son, too many enemies, too much influence. Cromwell didn't need love to move. He needed a path. He even gave up apartments, so Edward Seymour could host Jane in rooms connected to the king's private spaces. It was staging proximity without scandal access, without accusation. The courtship became a performance. Henry played the honorable suitor. Jane played the modest maiden. Her family played protective guardians. But beneath the performance, something darker was taking shape. Ending Henry's marriage to Anne through normal means was impossible without chaos. So the solution shifted from legal separation to total removal. Anne could feel the temperature changing. Then the jousting accident in late January hit like a hammer. Henry was thrown from his horse and lay unconscious for hours. The court panicked. Anne, pregnant and terrified, miscarried, soon after a loss rumored to be a boy. Henry offered little comfort, and as Anne grieved, she learned where Henry was spending his recovery. Not with his wife, with Jane. The moment that shattered any remaining illusion was humiliating in its simplicity. Anne walked in and found Jane sitting on Henry's lap, calm and composed, as if Anne were the intruder. Anne's rage erupted, and every outburst became evidence against her in the court of whispers. Henry's inner circle began repeating the same story. Anne was unstable, difficult, impossible to manage. Jane never raised her voice. Jane never demanded. The comparison was intentional, and it was deadly. By April, Henry's visits to Jane had become routine and openly discussed among those close to him. Jane's family began receiving titles and access. Anne could feel the ground sliding away beneath her feet. She tried to fight back with the same sharpness that had once captivated Henry, but he no longer wanted sharp. He wanted soft. He wanted obedience. On 2 May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were monstrous adultery with 5 men, conspiracy to murder the king, and incest with her own brother. None of it needed to be true. It only needed to be disgusting enough that defending her would look like defending treason. Truth stopped mattering the moment Henry decided what came next. And while Anne entered the Tower, Jane was being positioned to become queen with terrifying speed. With Anne imprisoned, Jane was moved to Chelsea with careful purpose, not hidden staged. Chelsea sat along the Thames, about a mile from the king's apartments by river, close enough for Henry to visit quietly at night, far enough to maintain the illusion that he was distracted by state matters, not replacing his wife before the body was cold. These were the secret nights. Henry traveled by barge with only a small group sworn to silence. There are no detailed records of what they said, but the purpose is obvious. Jane was being prepared for queenship. Henry was being soothed into certainty. Each visit reinforced the story he needed to believe. Anne was chaos and betrayal. Jane was correction and peace. Meanwhile, the machinery of destruction turned. Cromwell built the case. Interrogations happened fast. Confessions were forced. Timelines were bent until they fit the script. The point wasn't investigation. It was execution with paperwork attached. Anne's trial became theater, with a verdict already written. And just as chilling, the legal erasure of her marriage advanced even before she was dead. The goal was not merely to kill Anne, but to erase her as Henry's wife, to make the replacement look clean. While Anne waited in stone rooms inside the tower, Jane waited in comfort across the river, being transformed from lady-in-waiting into future queen. Anne was condemned alongside 5 men: Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn. The evidence was thin to the point of transparency. Smeaton's confession was extracted under pressure and likely torture. The others denied everything. Dates didn't match. Witnesses contradicted each other. None of it mattered. The jury was selected for obedience. Even Anne's composure and intelligence could not save her, because she was never meant to survive the process. Cromwell and the court then erased her on paper as well as in life. Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Anne invalid on flimsy technicalities. It was a legal fiction designed to make Anne never truly queen and to declare Elizabeth illegitimate. Henry positioned himself as the victim of a false marriage, not the husband executing his wife. Anne's last days became torture by waiting. Her execution was delayed at first, not from mercy, but from logistics. She asked for one mercy, a skilled swordsman from Calais, so she would not be hacked apart by an axe. Henry granted it a strange kindness from a man orchestrating her death. On the morning of 19 May 1536, Anne was led to Tower Green. She spoke carefully to protect her daughter, then knelt. A distraction was called. The sword fell. One stroke, and England's queen became a body placed in an old arrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared. Within hours, the news reached Henry. He did not mourn. He changed into bright clothing, mounted his horse, and rode toward Chelsea. The river was calm. 1 mile between the tower where Anne's body lay cooling and the house where Jane waited. Henry arrived before noon, confident, almost relieved, like a man freed from a burden rather than haunted by a death. Jane greeted him with her characteristic quietness. If she knew Anne's blood was still fresh on the scaffold, she gave no sign. Less than 24 hours later, on 20 May, Henry formally betrothed Jane Seymour. Not weeks later, not after mourning. The next day, the speed was obscene, but it was also calculated. Delay would have allowed doubt to grow and sympathy to breathe. Speed smothered questions before they formed. On 30 May 1536, only 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane at Whitehall in a small private ceremony. No grand cathedral, no public celebration. Even Jane's coronation was delayed, supposedly, until pregnancy, because spectacle invites comparison. The court adjusted instantly. Anne's allies scrambled to rewrite their loyalties. Jane's family rose like a tide, collecting titles and access, while the memory of Anne was pushed into silence. Jane was marketed as purity and stability, the anti-Anne. But the timeline exposed the truth. Henry's propaganda tried to hide one woman's end and another woman's beginning were not separate stories. They were the same event told from two sides of the scaffold. History often softens Jane into a passive figure, a modest woman swept along by forces beyond her control. That version is too generous. Jane was 27, experienced in court life, and she had watched queens be discarded from the inside. She knew how Henry operated. She understood that for her to rise, Anne had to fall, and she stepped forward anyway. Her refusal of gifts was not innocent morality. It was negotiation. She held out because she knew the lesson: mistresses are used and discarded wives get crowns. Jane did not order Anne's death. but she accepted the crown it made possible. Henry didn't kill Anne in a sudden fit of rage. He killed her because it was the most efficient solution to a problem, a wife who no longer served his goals. When you look at the dates, the brutality becomes undeniable. Arrest on 2 May 1536, execution on 19 May, wedding on 30 May. 17 days from queen to corpse, 11 days from beheading to remarriage. Speed was the strategy. It prevented sympathy and erased alternatives. Jane's reign was short. In October 1537, she gave Henry the son he craved, Edward, then developed a fatal infection and died on 24 October 1537, 12 days after childbirth. In death, she received what Anne was denied: honor mourning, a royal tomb. Henry later asked to be buried beside her. The final image is chilling. The king who killed to replace wives lies eternally beside the woman who benefited from the speed of Anne's destruction. The secret nights were not romance. They were conspiracy.